Before we start this video, a large thank you to Alexander, Marlith, Joey, Kai, Lucas, Dakota, and Robert for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello guys, okay, so today we're going to do some housekeeping. So, as you can see, I have all the scripts here on the player game object and the player model object right below that. Now, I did that a long time ago, and I honestly don't really like that concept, because you can only get animation events from the scripts that are on the same game object as the animator, which is right below our character. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy every script one by one and remove it from here and put it right here so they're all on the same game object. And we're going to do this so basically we're able to call some animation events from other scripts besides the select few that are on that model game object, and also because it just looks neater and I find it much cleaner and nicer. This is the way I handle it in my solo project, and I find the workflow to be very nice. So we're going to do that, and we're also going to go clean up some naming conventions, and we're going to clean up a couple bugs, and we're going to organize some things. This will be part one of an ongoing housekeeping part of the series, and I'll have another video out this week because I don't consider this one really a full-on lesson, although there will be bugs squished and whatnot. So let's start with the player inventory scripts, and we're going to open it up. Wait for that to load here now, and let's take a look. Okay, so what you want to do is right here where it says get component in children, we're just going to change it to get component. Anything that says get component in children, that is one of the main scripts, will now, or even parent, will just now be called get component. I'm going to clear off all these scripts because we're going to do this nice and easy one by one. I'm also going to start renaming some things in a bit, but I'll wait just a minute. Alright, so that is good. Okay, now player locomotion. Let's go down here to the awake method. And as you can see here, we have an animator handler, get component in children. We're just going to change that to get component. Whoops, get component. Alright, and actually too, I'm going to rename this to player animator manager. Now, I'm going to rename a lot of my things to player insert script name here, and the reason why is because we're going to make our enemy scripts derive from a base class, and our player scripts will also derive from that. Basically, our enemy and our players are going to share a lot of the same logic, and that's going to be coming up soon in the next couple of episodes. Alright, so in here, again, just get rid of the components. I'm going to rename this to player, and I'm going to say get component instead of get component children. But the reason we're doing this is because if we use base classes, we can actually share, because we do share a lot of the same functionality across the enemies and the players, like equipping weapons and moving and such, we can actually just use these base classes for both, and it makes our logic a lot more modular and easier to manage when we have a lot of new things added onto that. So that will be up and coming very shortly. Now let's just keep going through these scripts here. I'm going to rename this to, oh my goodness. No, not player manager. That's my bad. I thought that was the player stat manager. Oh, I mean the stats, player stats rather. Let's just undo that really quick. That was my mistake. Okay. Now, on the awake method again, or the player stats rather, sorry, we're going to rename it to player stats manager, and we'll have an enemy stats manager, and then we'll derive from the base class of character stats. I'm just going to call that character stats manager, just to keep the naming conventions the same throughout. Okay, that looks good. Now here on the awake method, let's check and see if we have anything there. Nope, that's fine. Now let's move on to the next script. Okay, so this might happen to you. Let's just remove the component. It does that sometimes when you rename scripts. So look up player stats manager, is whatever we just called it, and drag it back on here, like so. Or right here, there we go. Oh my goodness, okay, so I forgot, unpack the prefab first, my bad, right click, prefab, unpack completely, and then drag it onto the script, like so. And there we go. Alright, now let's continue on with this. Just gonna organize this so the player manager is gonna come first up here like that, there we go. Let's go and open up that and check some stuff out in here. So that looks good. Okay. So the animator, I'm just going to call that animator. I don't like short abbreviations. That's just my own personal taste. Player stats, going to say player stats manager. If you guys want to use short abbreviations, by all means, go for it. I just like the code to read like a book. Just my preference. Okay. That looks good. Let's jump over here. All right. So on the awake method here, the player animator manager, get component, and the animator can actually stay the same right now. Okay, save. Okay, let's exit out. All right. Moving on. Let's go to the input handler here. All right. So in the awake method here, again, let's just erase this. Get component in children to just get component. And the player effects manager, the player animator manager, the weapon slot manager, and the animator handler. We can keep the blocking collider the same because that's actually a component that's placed under our character. Okay, let's do that and save that. We also need to rename that animator handler in a bit. I'll rename all that stuff over time. I'm going to put the input handler up here first, right on top of the player manager. It just looks more organized in my opinion. The player inventory. Okay, let's rename this to player inventory manager to keep the naming conventions the same, because these are all managing components of our player's logic, so I just want to make that clear. Okay, now on the input handler's awake method here, I'm also just going to rename the player inventory manager variable as well, and the player stats variable as well. Let's get all that. I'm being very meticulous because in the long run it will make the project read nicer, and it will keep me and you much more organized. Naming conventions are very important in my opinion, and a lot of people overlook them. It's easy to leave them by the wayside until it's too late, and then you get a lot of mess later down the road. All right, so player inventory manager. Let's just drag this up here like so, because that script just became error. There we go. All right, player locomotion. I'm going to name that player locomotion manager. There we go. And let's go and rename some of the variables here as well. We have the player stats. I'll rename that to player stats manager. That looks good. That's fine. Yeah, I think all this is good. Now in the awake method. Yeah, okay, we're good. Let's save that. On to the next script. Let that save. Okay, weapon slot manager. So I'm going to rename that too. So this is just handling our weapons. We're going to use one of these for our enemy too. We'll make a base class in the future. So let's call this, just call it player weapon slot manager. And we'll have an enemy weapon slot manager in the future as well. Okay, let's see. Yeah, it looks good. Now in the awake method, we can actually condense some of this code again. So first, let's rename the player inventory to player inventory manager. And get component in parent, we can erase that to just get component in parent. Let's erase that to get component. Okay, that looks good. Down here, get component in parent will be just get component. The animator would actually be get component in children right now. Let's reorganize the way this is called too, just for neatness sake. Let's put our input handler first, and then all of our players' functionality scripts right below that. This is again just for the sake of being neat, honestly, right now at this point. Get component in parent will be get component. That's good. Let's see if we can do this without getting an error. We're probably going to get an error first, though. So, okay, we can actually condense this code too. So let's make a private void, and we'll call this get weapon. Actually, we're going to call it load weapon holder slots to keep the naming conventions the same as well. Load weapon holder slots, not to be confused with load both weapons on slots. This actually loads the slots themselves that are assigned to your character's hands, and those slots are what the weapons are instantiated on. Okay, so then we're going to say load weapon on slots after all other logic right here, and that looks good. That is so much nicer, goodness. Okay, great, fantastic. We can actually still make this look a bit neater too. We'll come back to that in a second though. I just want to get everything done first. Okay, that just did the same thing as before, so you know the drill. If this happens to you again, just search up player weapon slot manager and drag it onto this area right here. Okay. That looks good. All right, let's go to the player attacker next. And I'm going to rename that to player combat manager. That sounds much more dignified, and it kind of just makes more sense. And we'll apply that. And we're going to follow our same train of logic here. Let's rename weapon slot manager to player weapon slot manager. And then looks like here in the awake method, we have a couple of things to change here. All right, so let's actually name player inventory to the player inventory manager, player stats to player stats manager. You get the drill by now. Okay, and I'm just going to place this up here. All right, and let's rename Player Animator Manager to Player Animator Manager. And I'll place the input handler up top too, just to keep it all looking nice and clean and organized. All right, there we go. The input and the camera, then the player functionality itself. Nice. Now, down here, we don't need inParent for this. Let's erase that. We don't need inParent for this. Let's erase that. We don't need inParent for this. Let's erase that. And if you want to, as I just did up top, you can also erase the parent from there and place this above everything else on the awake method as well. But it's not necessary. So let's go on to the next script. Now I know this is a lot to follow for some of you if you're not as quick at jumping from script to script, but just take your time. Don't worry. We're going to make it all come together. Now, over here on the Player Equipment Manager, let's go down to, I think there's only 3 scripts. Yes, there is. So just these 3, because the rest are actually the scripts that change the models themselves placed on your character's model. They obviously are still in the children of everything, so those are fine. All right. Player Stats is changed to Player Stats Manager, and Player Inventory is changed to Player Inventory Manager. All right. Now, Player Effects Manager, Player Stats Manager, Weapon Slot Manager, Player Weapon Slot Manager. Okay. I think I missed a couple things. I'm just going to go back and check on some things real quick. All right, let's go over here to the input handler and rename the player attacker to Player Combat Manager. That will match the script's name. Do I have 2 Player Animator Managers on? Yeah, this one's not being called Player Animator Manager. That's weird. Okay, so we can just delete one of these after. It doesn't matter which one because they both have the same name. Strange I had 2 of the same variable there. I guess I missed that. Okay, let's erase that. There we go. All right, looks good. Let's save that. Now, on the Player Inventory Manager, change this to Player Weapon Slot Manager. Again, I'm hitting all the naming conventions here. All them all look neat. Now, on the Player Equipment Manager, drag in your naked head model again because you're going to need to. And then you're going to want to go and actually put these names in one by one. You can just double click the game object and copy and paste it. There we go. I've jumped ahead, so this is all done now. Very straightforward. And on your UI Manager, drag in your Player Inventory Manager. Now, if you want to, you can go to your UI Manager script and actually call that on awake. Might make more sense to do so. I'm going to go to the Player Animator Manager and say animator equals get component in children now because it's a child object. And let's just put that right up there. Okay. Input handler goes up here. And Player Stats is Player Stats Manager. This is going to look so nice when we're done. And it's going to read much better. Player Locomotion Manager, there we go. All right. Input Manager, put that up there. There we go. Looks nice. Very straightforward. Now I'm going to equip, I'm going to place my unarmed weapon here rather. Because we need to fill back in some things on our inspector here. Now, if I load up my character, you'll see if I have weapons here, it's fine, and I get no error. And that's all well and good. But if I take off the weapons and actually put these right here to none, you will see that I will actually get an error, and I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to make sure all these weapons are off here, the left and right weapon, and the weapons in left hands and right hand slots. And what happens is in the inspector, boom, I get a couple errors there. So we're going to fix that. And that's a very old bug I did not address because I kind of forgot it existed. But basically this has to do with our character not fetching the unarmed weapon and equipping it if there's nothing in the inspector. So we're going to copy that and delete it. And then we're going to go to the weapon slot manager here. We're going to right click and go to low weapons on slots. And then we're going to just scroll up a little bit here. And what you want to do is actually paste the variable for the unarmed weapon. And we're going to assign it in this function right here because it's fetching a weapon item. And if there's none there, it's not doing anything. So let's just paste the variable here for unarmed weapon. We're going to put it, right here. This is fine. There we go. And I'll even give it a header. I'm going to make a few headers, actually, just to make this more neat in the inspector, too. I will call this header unarmed weapon. I will call the header above this one attacking weapon because this is the weapon you're currently attacking with. Just going to make it look neat for neatness sake. And then down here, I'm going to make a header. I'm going to call this weapon slots. These are the weapons or slots your weapons actually instantiate on. And right here, a header for damage colliders. Very nice and very straightforward. It will look nicer in the inspector now and easier to read. All right, that looks good. I'm going to take these scripts here. As I said earlier, I told you I'd come back to this and we'll paste those and just make them look a bit more organized because this just doesn't need to look like this. Let's put this above here and let's get the input handler and put that up here. So then you have the, there we go. And that looks good. Cool. UI, and then the input, and then the player function scripts. Rename player stats to player stats manager. Okay, man, I love neat looking names. All right, let's go down here now and actually get to the logic. So there's a few ways we could do this. So what we're going to do first is come over to the player inventory manager scripts, and we're going to make sure the errors here, we just put player weapon slot manager in front of the variable unarmed weapon because it's now over here on the player weapon slot manager. So we're going to do that, and then we'll get rid of that error. And now let's go over here and do it to the change left weapon function as well. So the change left and change right weapon function. Save that. Now, make sure you put in your unarmed weapon inside the unarmed weapon variable and go into the weapon itself, add a game object, and add a damage collider to it. I'm not going to edit dimensions of that right now. We can play with that later. But just so we don't get an error, I'm just going to throw that on there and I'm going to add a box collider to it. Okay, that looks good. Now, this will be the default weapon we go if we have none equipped. So now on the player weapon slot manager, low weapon on slot, we're going to say if weapon does not equals null, then we're going to do all this logic. So let's just copy this and paste it in here if the weapon is not null. There we go. And else we're going to perform assigning our unarmed weapon. But let's actually clean this up a little bit because a lot of this is unnecessary. So I'm going to get rid of this region because I think it's ugly here. Don't need it. We're checking for the weapon being null right away, so we don't need this if weapon does not equal null. So let's get rid of that, and I'm just going to paste this right there. You can delete this completely. You can take this code down in the bottom because this will be the else. So I will delete all that, and we'll just snip this down here for now. Put it right there. Now going back up, we can actually come into this little area to do the same thing. Let's get rid of the region. Let's backspace here, and yeah, we can get rid of this if weapon item does not equal null because again we're checking that before we get into the function. So we'll keep the logic. There we go. Delete this region, and that is so much cleaner right away. All right, now down here in the else function, let's actually set up the code to assign our unarmed weapon. So we're going to say if is left, do some logic, and else is right. It must be. So if it's your left hand, assign the unarmed left hand weapon. If it's your right hand, assign the unarmed right hand weapon. And we're going to say first, left hand slot dot current weapon equals unarmed weapon. And we can actually copy all this logic up here and paste it because it's very similar. We'll say load the weapon model, which in this case is nothing except for the damage collider, and load left weapon damage collider, and then update the UI. And we'll do the same thing with the right one, except we'll replace left with right. So this will, by default, load your unarmed weapon to your right and left hands. Whoops, that's a lowercase r. If you have no weapon equipped. Now we have to do a couple more things, and then it will work. So, one sec. Load right. There we go. All right, that looks good. Now we actually have to assign, change that to false on the UI, so it's actually not changing the left icon. Yeah, this looks good. Now we actually have to assign the weapons in the inventory too, because if there's nothing assigned in the inventory, we're loading a weapon, but we also need to assign the unarmed weapon itself to the weapon in the inventory. Because you're going to get this code if there's no weapon at all assigned, not even the unarmed weapon. So we're going to put the animations in here as well, save that. And then you can actually even change this to unarmed weapon if you want, or you can keep it as weapon item, and you can put a variable for a weapon item above. It's really your choice. It's all the same. So you can just do this and make it all unarmed weapon, or you can keep it weapon item, and you can say weapon item equals unarmed weapon. Now, up here, just above this is what I mean. You can just say weapon item is equal to unarmed weapon, and then you could just change all the unarmed weapon to weapon item so it stays with the same, I guess, conventions as the above, which I have just done now. So then we say player inventory manager dot left weapon is equal to unarmed weapon or weapon item. It doesn't matter. And player inventory manager dot right weapon is equal to unarmed weapon or weapon item if you have the variable above like me. And that should be good. So now if we go into the game here, you'll see we actually get an error. If I double click that, it brings us to this load weapons on screen. This is actually not an error with the code. Just go to your player inventory manager and make sure you have 2 weapons in right-hand slots and 2 weapons in left-hand slots, because the code is looking for an additional one. Otherwise, you'll get an index rate for it being out of range. But remember, we made this. We made the weapon slots to be able to support 2 weapons on each hand. And if you start the game, you're fine. So we have another problem. If I roll, you can see my model goes outside the center of the game object, and we have that really weird syncing effect. I just messed up a little bit. I'm really sorry. Every script we just put on the player game object, we actually have to put on the animator game object. So I'm going to rename player model player, because it's actually not the player model, it's just the animator. And right below it is the model. And I'm going to just right-click, copy component, and then paste, right-click up here, paste component as new. And just do that for everything. That's all you got to do. No more rewrites, except for, I think, rewriting the animator's get component to just get component. But we'll go back to that in a second. So right-click, copy, and just do this. Now I'm going to cut back here, and I'll be right back in a second. Okay, I'm back. So that's all well and good. And now I'm going to drag this out, and I'm going to delete the old player game object. So right now you see I have modular characters. Before I delete it, though, actually, I'm going to expand this, and I'm going to rename the modular characters my player model, because that's the actual model. I'll just name that model. I'm going to drag in the lock-on transform right below all that, the combat colliders, the raycast starts points, and the combat transforms. I think the only thing you'll have to actually manually drag in is on the player locomotion. You'll have to drag in the new character collider, because it's actually, yeah, right here. There we go. All right, that's good. Now I think we actually have to change where we call our animator to as well, because these scripts are referring to the animator as get component and children, but now the animator will be get component. So change that as well. So again, the animator, make sure any script that references the animator, it is get component. So here I am in the scripts. Just go here, go to your animator, where it says get component and children, just change it to get component. And lastly, click on your player UI and redrag your player inventory onto that again. If you want to, open up the player UI and just even say player inventory equals find object of type on awake player inventory, because we're going to change this in the future anyway. And if you do that, you should be fine, just like this. And we could have just coded it so we sync up the model with the game object on top, but this is much nicer. And plus, like I said at the first of the video, we need the scripts on the same game object as the animator for animation events. So this looks so much better. We've fixed an unearned bug, and now we've set up our hierarchy in our scripts to support deriving from classes for our enemy and player. So this is basically the framework now for how we're going to handle a lot of our data. And in the next video, we're going to redo our or reorganize and restructure our enemy's AI, and we're going to share a bunch of data between the players. And by that I mean we're basically going to make their classes inherit a lot of their info from a base class, and it'll make our combinations of logic so much more modular, and it'll be so much easier to work with moving forward. So this was a very important step. I can't stress that enough. So if you guys did like the video, be sure to drop a like, leave a comment. It does help appease the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're feeling super generous, check out my Patreon below. Now, if you guys have any bugs in the series that you'd like me to address, and I don't mean just bugs on your end alone, I mean general bugs that you've noticed that if you have a copy of the code perhaps, or you know you're following it correctly, and you've found some bugs, let me know, because we're going to start regular bug squashing episodes too, because we have enough content now that we can start to polish a bit of it, and we're still going to add new content as well. So because this was a housekeeping video, there will be another video up this week that will be actual new content added to the series. All right, with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one.